We'll be speaking with Dr. Robert Levenson from the University of California, Berkeley, who's going to be speaking with us about this question that's guided much of our discussion today: blood, tears, sweat, and fears, the autonomic nervous system and emotion. So Dr. Levenson received his PhD from Vanderbilt University in clinical psychology, and he's currently a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's a member of both the behavioral neuroscience, clinical science, developmental, and social personality programs. He currently serves as the director of the Institute for Personality and Social Research, as well as the director of the Clinical Science Program. So Dr. Levenson's research program is in the area of human emotion, studying the organization of physiological, behavioral, and subjective systems, the way that these systems are impacted by neuropathology, normal aging, and culture, and the role that emotions play in the maintenance and disruption of committed relationships. Dr. Levenson's research has been supported by grants from the NIMH and the NIA, and he is the past president of the Society for Psychophysiological Research and the past president of the Association for Psychological Science. So I now turn to a very special Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Robert Levenson from the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Bob. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. So what I wanted to start out asking you a bit about is really what got you first interested in the study of emotion. Kind of where did it all begin for you?
Well, actually, this is one of these questions where I not only have an answer, but I remember the exact moment. I had just started my first faculty position at Indiana University, and the field at that time was dominated by Richard Lazarus's work on sort of stress and coping. It really wasn't a field of emotion. It was really going to be another 6 or 7 years before it started to explode. And in the models of stress and coping, you got the idea that there was a sort of a stress response, and everybody did the same thing. If you provoke them in your laboratory, everybody would pretty much have the same reaction. And people before Lazarus, like Hans Selye, had described the physiology of that response quite elegantly. One of the things that was starting to come into the field was greater reliance on video recording. And we had just run a classic stress study where we had threatened people with electric shock, and we had them give self-revealing speeches about their weaknesses and insecurities. And
Pleasant
I was
studies.
expecting, when I looked at these videotapes, to see these sort of fixed action patterns where everybody was doing the same thing. And it was just the opposite. There was just this incredible variety of response. It was complex. It unfolded over time. It changed over time for different people, and some of it was quite counterintuitive. This is going to seem really dumb, but the fact that people were laughing when they were threatened with, it was real electric shock. We actually shocked them in those days. We were allowed to do that. And you know, it wasn't this sort of like general negative stress response. It was this rainbow of different things. And I realized that this was very important, and I had no idea how to study it. I had no idea how to measure it or quantify it, and the behavior really defied anything that I could probably get at with a self-report measure or the physiological measures that I was measuring. So I got interested in that, and as a result, I won't tell you the whole story, but about 3 or 4 years later, I was able to come out to San Francisco to spend a year working with these two crazy guys, Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen, who had sort of spent a decade focusing on how you measure this very thing, you know, and they were developing a coding system for characterizing the full variety of human emotional response. And so that's how I got interested in it. It was compelling in what I was seeing, that something was going on here that was much more differentiated than I had expected.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's a really compelling story. Just by observing a phenomena, you saw something that you didn't understand, and that's really what propelled all the research that you're doing now. And I mean, really as a forefront in this field of emotion, as well as psychophysiology, I mean, you do work that inspires so many generations, like myself and others, to try to continue to grapple with these questions and phenomena that we observe but we don't understand.
Well, I think that's the best way to do research. I mean, I know that's your last question, but maybe we'll come back to it. But, I think research that's grounded in fundamental curiosity about the things that amaze and baffle you is the research that, is going to keep your interest for a long period of time. And I think if you're lucky and if you hit on good questions, it will attract other people to those issues. But curiosity is sort of at the core of my sort of approach to research.
So, I mean, when thinking about curiosity and the realm of psychophysiology, I mean, you have really sort of taken a lead in specializing in these really complex, psychophysiological tools to study emotion. And I mean, in your opinion, sort of, what do you see as some of the most effective tools for trying to understand and measure this really complex, rainbow, as you call it, of emotional responding?
Well, I'm gonna give you an answer that's probably a little strange, and that is that I think the best psychophysiological tools are good and appropriate research questions. That is, when I was first getting involved in psychophysiology, one of the dominant voices in the field was a fellow named Paul Obrist, who was working in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of North Carolina. Could have been Duke. I know that's an important distinction, but I just don't remember which one it was.
That range.
Yeah, but it was UNC. That's where it was, and he was a curmudgeonly guy, and he was a fighter, and he also championed young people who were working in the field. And his mantra was, we need to know more biology. We need to understand the biology of these measures. And it had a huge influence on me. And to this day, I always try to, I think the art of psychophysiology is to ask a question that for which these measures are appropriate. I can't tell you how many people write notes when they're applying to graduate school and say, I want to use these measures and methods. It's like measure first. And if I get a chance to talk to them, I always sort of say, well, what's the question? And a lot of questions in psychology are not appropriate for these kinds of methods and measures. So that's the first thing. Good psychophysiology is based on good questions and a good understanding. These are not psychological measures, they're biological measures. They aren't measuring personality and they aren't measuring emotion. They're measuring, metabolic processes and adjustment of the homeostasis in the body and how we match them into these psychological questions. That's the art of good psychophysiological research. And I think it's really, really difficult. And it's easy to have a mismatch where the measure, no matter how sophisticated, how down to the millisecond the accuracy and the millivolt is, it can be the wrong measure for a psychological question, and then you just get nothing. So that's the prelude. I know that's not exactly what you were getting at, but then I think getting to the measures themselves, I think the challenge has always been, how can we get from the behavior of these target organs, the heart, lungs, and whatnot, to the underlying action of the nervous system? Because we really want to understand it in terms of sympathetic and parasympathetic, and within these, beta and alpha adrenergic subsystems. We really want to get a sense of what part of the nervous system is active. And that has been an area where there's been enormous progress over the last 20, 30 years. It used to be that we could measure what organs were doing, but we couldn't really infer what the activating mechanisms were. And that's been a real powerful tool. And, and it turns out that changes in heart rate, let's say, that are instigated by parasympathetic action, map onto very different psychological constructs than ones that are instigated by sympathetic action. And so to be able to get that kind of underlying mechanism to be revealed, in our psychophysiological measures, I think that's been a huge advance in terms of getting to the real core of phenomena like emotion, or attachment, or these big psychological constructs where the physiology can actually tell us some very interesting things.
So when you think about really trying to probe underlying mechanisms further, where do you see some of the next most critical steps in the field of psychophysiology moving towards to be able to do this, to get at some of these really profound processes you were hinting, like emotion, attachment, and the like?
Well, I hope this isn't self-serving, but it's certainly what I've been thinking about in the last couple of years. I mean, I've been really interested in the sort of the mimetic side of physiology. My own work, going back for a long time, I've constantly gotten attracted to the ways that sort of physiology provides a measure of contagion, and it provides a way of characterizing the degree of sort of connection between people who are interacting, and in emotion, it provides a way of looking at the sort of the coherence between different aspects of the emotional response. So, in answer to your question, I think the era of the mean is probably over. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're going to have to go back to the reality of physiology, which it is a time series. It's something that unfolds over time and has cyclicities, and it does have changes in levels, but that's just part of that pattern. And I think the challenge is going to be finding ways to characterize physiology over time, how it relates to other unfolding phenomena in the individual, like their subjective experience and their emotional behavior, and how it sort of operates when two people are in an interaction. And so how your physiology and my physiology and the kind of temporal relationships between them give us clues to the kind of psychological connection that we're engaged in. So I think that's the next frontier. And it's really challenging. I've been going back the last few months and rereading all the stuff I read when I was in graduate school about things like time series analyses and Fourier analyses and order regression and whatnot, and trying to sort of come up with a fresh approach for characterizing some of these temporal relationships. So it's what's on my mind these days.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about, some of the original groundbreaking work you did here, where you identified, distinct patterns of autonomic nervous system activity with particular emotion states. And on the one hand, I wanted to ask you sort of, what do you see as the most interesting discoveries in that original work? But what you're saying now makes me think, too, sort of how can we move that field forward of emotion specificity if we're looking at these more dynamic fluctuations in physiology over time?
That's what I'm thinking about. I mean, I remember very clearly. I used to have one slide in one talk, based on one emotional elicitation in one individual. It was actually two different emotions, and it was just looking at what happened to heart rate second to second when that person was experiencing profound disgust versus profound anger. And the differences were not. You could see where the mean differences came from. The fact that at the end of the day, most of the time when you're angry, your heart is going to accelerate much more than when you're disgusted. In fact, when you're disgusted, it often decelerates. So you can see how you got there, but the temporal path to that was so different for these two emotions in this one individual. And how to characterize that and do it in a way that's meaningful and not just descriptive, and can be scaled up to studies. I think that is one of the really important new frontiers in the study of specificity. And I think the same thing is probably true if you're looking at the brain. You you really want to look at not only where it ends up in terms of what the active areas are, but also how it got there. And I think the brain people, the functional imaging people, are much more inclined to work in that way.
Well, I mean, speaking of the brain, I mean, you've really uncovered some additional fascinating insights about how neurodegenerative diseases like frontotemporal dementia, or FTD, profoundly impact, a whole host of different emotion-related processes, right? You've looked at perception, reactivity, as well as regulation, both spontaneous and cued. And I wonder, as you're thinking about psychophysiology in this realm, at the realm of sort of neural systems and neurodegenerative diseases, sort of what were some discoveries you came up, in doing this research? Were they surprising to you? What sort of struck you in working with this population?
Well, we started with the observation that, here was a well-characterized neurological condition that was producing something that looked very much like psychiatric symptoms. I'm not a real clinical psychologist, but I sort of play one in my profession.
Yes, you are.
I think one of the great gifts of graduate training for me was being trained as a clinical psychologist, because I have a pretty good sense of what clinical conditions and symptoms look like. And I was really struck with these patients, who didn't have icebox parents and didn't have, low birth weight and didn't have, all sorts of psychogenic kind of factors in their life, that they were producing these kinds of symptoms that look very much like psychiatric conditions. And so, as is typical of my work, I was just struck by that and became very curious as to, how it was that damage to these neural circuits. I mean, now we understand that it's not regions, it's circuits that are really producing these changes, could produce things that mimic these kinds of clinical phenomena. And it seemed to me that it could tell us a lot about emotion. It could also tell us a lot about emotion-based pathologies. And so that to me was the kind of the surprise in it was just how powerfully these diseases produce these symptoms. When I was in graduate school, the chapter on brain damage was always just about cognitive changes, with the exception maybe of Phineas Gage. And that was such a terrible case study. Who knew what happened? But as a result, I always skipped it when I taught clinical psychology, because it didn't have anything to do with emotion. So what surprised me is that there's this whole set of neurodegenerative diseases that actually are like a silver bullet into the heart of our emotional functioning. Really underdescribed, underappreciated, getting better now, misdiagnosed, just like we call it dementia, which suggests, problems in mentation and memory. But, here's this other set of disorders that are really quite different. And of course, the reason for that is that they affect very different kinds of circuits in the brain. So the exciting thing for me was, here was an opportunity to really study emotion in the brain without the constraints of the scanner. I mean, we didn't have to only study those emotional things that could occur in a tube. We could study all the things that happen in real life and link them back ultimately to fairly well characterized changes in the brain. I just thought this was a great new playground.
What have you found, in this research you've done with this group of FTD patients and other neurodegenerative diseases? Sort of, what has it told you about the role of the brain in sort of normative emotion processing?
Yeah. Well, it's not a finished story. I mean, it's kind of like a second wind in a career or something. It's like we started doing this work about a decade ago, and good questions take decades to lead to good answers. And I sort of feel like we're still midstream. The thing that I'm really found myself thinking about a lot and the people in my lab also gravitating to, and the people we collaborate with. It is really ironic, is the role of sort of the subjective emotional experience, and particularly the contribution of visceral perception and visceral sensations to our emotional lives. We think that because this disease targets circuits that are critical for the processing of this visceral information, we think that the kind of the interior emotional lives of these patients lose the kind of the visceral quality, the butterflies in the stomach and probably some of the somatic qualities like tensions and whatnot, the sense of coolness and warmth, the tingling on the skin, that all of these things that are really, I think we're coming to understand critical parts of how emotion influences our behavior, are probably being diminished and muted by this disease. And then when you see people who don't have this part of their emotions, you begin to realize just how important they are. And it certainly has made my normal emotion research get much more focused these days on visceral perception, trying to find ways of characterizing that and measuring it, which has been historically a very difficult problem in the field. How do you characterize the extent of visceral awareness, and how do you monitor it moment to moment?
Yeah, so this is fascinating. Just thinking about where you first began in this field, observing a phenomena that was mysterious and exciting, to being, forefront at the figure of the field of emotion, and as well as in psychophysiological processes that help us understand emotion-related phenomena. And sort of having seen the field of emotion evolve over time, I guess sort of taking a step back, where do you see now the face of the future in emotion headed? What lies ahead?
Well, clearly the head lies ahead. Emotion started as being sort of the province of the autonomic nervous system. And, all the models were that linked cognition and emotion were all top down. And so, in the early views, emotions were sort of these irritating, nasty little things that had to be brought under the control of rational processes. And now, I don't think there's any question that it's been turned upside down, that now almost all of psychology seems to be about the influence of emotion on other things, including a whole range of cognitive processes. Probably most famously, how emotions influence our decisions, and sometimes, cause us to decide things that don't appear to be rational by our sort of Western standards, but really are rational in terms of, our sort of reptilian standards. And that's fascinating. And embodied cognition is another area where this is really the case. So I think that one clear future direction is the bottom up direction, is the way emotions really shape our thinking, our memories. This is stuff that we've played with in the past, but I think there's a lot of good work that's necessary. The second area is clearly emotions and close relationships. I think attachment theory is one of these. It's like the James Lang theory of emotion. Bowlby's attachment theory is a great idea that really needs to be looked at with modern tools. And I think the way emotions function in making these lasting these lasting sort of interpersonal bonds is really another critical area. And then I think the other one that is kind of inescapable is that we live in an era where I think you could say, this is probably something people would argue with, but I think you could make the case that progress in the treatment of mental illness and the understanding of it has really hit a wall. And that both in psychiatry and in psychology, there's really been almost nothing significant in the last decade or so that's made a huge difference in our understanding or ability to prevent and treat mental illnesses. We're recycling old ideas. Now, there are a few exceptions to that. And we don't know what will come of them, like deep brain stimulation and things like that. It's a very different approach. Maybe something will come of that. So I think, this is going to be a huge area of growth in the coming decade. Really taking a fresh look at emotional disease, emotional dysfunction. And to that to happen, a number of things have to happen that are probably not going to happen. One is we have to do away with the DSM, and we have to go back to a much more molecular way of looking at symptoms, like the RDoC movement at NIMH. Mm-hmm. We've got to really clear out all of the interference, like from accreditation that keeps progressive programs from really training their students in the way they think they should be trained. And we have to learn how to talk to not only psychiatrists, but we have to learn how to talk to behavioral neurologists who have a different kind of understanding about the brain, and then sort of refocus on these issues. I think that could be the most exciting thing for the next generation. And I think, if we could get to that point and just throw away some of these the baggage of some of these old systems and old ideas, I think this could be the era of making, real progress in the understanding and treatment of mental illness.
So then when we're thinking about this next generation, right, a big part of who's going to be at the forefront are students right now. So when these students come to you, Bob, and ask you for advice of what they should do, if, wanting to embark in this field of emotion, what do you tell them?
Well, I think, there are probably 5 things that you really want to know a lot about. I think one, you want to know, if you're going to study emotion, you better learn how to observe a behavior. In my opinion, and some may disagree, most of the really exciting progress in emotion has been made in these kind of contexts where people directly observed emotional responding, and they had ways of quantifying it. And you can really parse emotion research into those who look at behavior and those who don't. So I think you need to understand the behavior. 2, you need to have a really strong foundation in biology. You need to understand the physiological systems, and increasingly these days that includes genetic systems and endocrine systems as well. And then I think you need to understand what emotion looks like when it's operating within normal bounds, and also when it's operating within these sort of dysfunctional and abnormal bounds. I think all emotion researchers need to have some exposure to emotion pathology, whether it's of neural, whether it's set off by some sort of neurodegenerative process or some sort of psychological process. But you really have to understand, like, what emotion looks like when it's not there, when it's blunted, or when it's or whether it's hyperactive, and you need to see that and understand that. And so I think those are the kinds of things, that good emotion researchers are going to have to know. And we don't train students that way. We sort of train them in silos. So clinical students do this, and neuroscience students do that, and affective science students, do something else. Yeah. But I think that good emotion research is going to really require this, behavior biology and pathology.
Great. Well, Bob, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
All right. Nice to see you, June.
Nice to see you, too. This concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Robert Levenson from the University of California at Berkeley.